We have been taught to believe that modern science holds an answer for everything, that the origin of existence is a puzzle virtually solved through mathematical equations and physical laws. Yet, that apparent certainty begins to crumble when we look back with enough attention. What if I told you that hidden within the most ancient verses of Genesis lie three anomalies that contemporary physics still cannot explain? This is not a clash between faith and science. We are speaking of precise descriptions written thousands of years ago about cosmological and biological phenomena that we are only now beginning to glimpse. The presence of a primordial light long before the formation of the stars. The sudden emergence of a self-replicating information code inside inert clay. And the memory of entities and cataclysms that defy the conventional timeline of our geology. Tonight, as the outside world falls silent and the darkness invites you to rest, we will step into these three great enigmas. Welcome to The Story Nobody Told. The primordial void, the paradox of light before the stars. To grasp the first great enigma of Genesis, we must place ourselves at the absolute threshold of nothingness. For generations, a superficial reading of this ancient text drew constant mockery from classical skeptics. In the narrative, light is summoned at the very first moment of cosmic order. Yet the sun, the moon, and the stars are not introduced until the fourth period of that same sequence. To the ordinary mind, this seemed like an obvious flaw of primitive cosmogony. It was argued that no rational observer could conceive of morning and evening without a celestial body in the sky. However, theoretical physics over the last century stumbled upon a startling reality that completely changed that perspective. When we trace back the mathematical models of the Big Bang, the early universe did not contain a single star. For hundreds of thousands of years, the cosmos was a dense, opaque, impenetrable fog of superheated plasma. Free electrons interacted so violently with photons that light remained trapped inside an invisible prison. There were no celestial bodies, no galaxies, no orbits, and no glowing spheres suspended in space. Everything was a homogeneous density where matter and energy were fused into a primordial soup. And then, an event occurred that modern astrophysics calls the recombination epoch. Roughly 380,000 years after the initial expansion, the temperature of the universe dropped to a critical threshold. Protons captured electrons to form the first neutral atoms of hydrogen and helium. At that exact moment, the cosmic fog lifted, and space became transparent for the very first time. A colossal flood of photons was released simultaneously and instantly in all directions. The entire universe was bathed in a uniform, omnipresent radiation without a single visible point source. There was light in every corner of the cosmos long before the first sun ever existed. That relic radiation, known today as the cosmic microwave background, still travels through the fabric of space. It is the quiet remnant of that first starless flash. The question lingering in the dark is not whether physics validates this phenomenon, but how it was conceived in such an archaic account. How could an ancient text distinguish between diffuse primordial luminosity and the focused light of stars? Any mythological storyteller across Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean exclusively associated light with the visible solar disk. Attributing illumination to a prior state independent of the sun contradicts ordinary human observation. Yet the Hebrew text employs two radically different words to describe these two distinct moments. In the first instance, it uses the term or referring to a diffuse luminous essence, to energy in its fundamental state. Later, when describing the fourth day, it uses the word mar, which specifically means a luminary, a vessel, or a physical emitter of light. This linguistic distinction is so precise that it defies the understanding of its own historical context. The text does not confuse the concept of a primordial photon field with that of a stellar fusion furnace. It describes a sequence where energy precedes structure, and radiation precedes gravitational bodies. Modern astrophysicists had to wait until the accidental discovery by Penzias and Wilson in 1964 to detect that same relic radiation filling the void. That electromagnetic whisper we can still hear today as static on an untuned frequency. It is the fingerprint of a universe that shone brilliantly in total solitude. A glow that required no nuclear combustion condensed into spheres of gas to exist. Imagine for a moment the vastness of that expanding space, illuminated by a continuous, warm and uniform sea of energy. An abstract landscape where time began to weave its first intervals in absolute cosmic silence. There were no eyes to witness it, nor solid surfaces upon which to cast a shadow. Only an electromagnetic frequency flooding the expanse, cooling slowly as the eons unfolded. Modern science required millennia of calculations, orbital telescopes, and differential equations to reach the exact same structural conclusion. First came the free radiation field. Much later, gravity gathered matter to ignite stars in the dark. The paradox, long dismissed as a mythological absurdity, became one of the cornerstones of observational astrophysics. And as the night moves forward and the silence deepens around you, the mind contemplates this strange symmetry between mathematical calculation and ancient memory. A flash born from nothingness that continues to travel through the cold of space, reminding us that light always inhabited the void before organized matter took shape. The real question, the one still floating in the stillness of the dark, is what other forgotten truth lies hidden within the next lines of the primordial abyss. The enigma of Tohu va-Vohu, chaotic matter before creation. When the opening words of the Hebrew account attempt to describe the state before form, they turn to an untranslatable and unsettling phrase, Tohu va-Vohu. For centuries, modern translations simplified this archaic expression as without form and void. Yet philologists and scholars of ancient Semitic languages know that this translation distorts the true nature of the concept. Tohu does not simply denote the absence of things, but a state of unknowable desolation, a formless nothingness that defies geometry. Vohu, on the other hand, evokes a vacuum charged with potential, a hollow substance waiting for a disturbance to collapse into reality. The text does not describe the absolute philosophical void of classical Greek thought. It portrays the presence of a primordial abyss, an infinite expanse of dark waters over which a force hovered in constant tension. To medieval thinkers, the idea of a chaotic ocean existing before physical creation seemed like an incomprehensible poetic metaphor. How could a fluid exist before space, time, and solid ground were established? The answer to this contradiction remained hidden until 20th century quantum physics formulated the concept of the quantum vacuum. In contemporary theoretical physics, an absolute void does not exist anywhere in the cosmos. What we call empty space is actually a boiling matrix of quantum fluctuations at infinitesimal scales. Virtual particles and antiparticles emerge from nothingness and annihilate each other in imperceptible fractions of time. The quantum vacuum is, in strictly mathematical terms, a sea of pure potential energy devoid of defined structure. It is a state of chaotic density that precedes the solidification of classical physical laws. When astrophysicists model the moment before cosmic symmetry breaking, they describe a state analogous to Tohu va-Vohu. A realm where spacetime possessed neither stable curvature nor defined macroscopic dimensions. Matter was not yet arranged into protons or neutrons, but dispersed across an ocean of probabilities with neither direction nor boundary. What is truly striking is why this archaic account insisted on using the metaphor of deep water to depict this state. In modern fluid physics, the primordial plasma of the early universe behaves precisely like a near-frictionless liquid. Hydrodynamic equations describe the behavior of that initial energy with greater accuracy than models of dispersed gas. Whoever composed or preserved Genesis did not choose the image of sand, dust, or dry rock to speak of the beginning. They chose the watery abyss, a continuous, dark, malleable, and unfathomably deep substance. The Hebrew word tiham, traditionally translated as the deep, shares its linguistic root with ancient Mesopotamian myths of primordial chaos monsters. Yet in the text of Genesis, that chaos is not a monster locked in combat with a warrior deity. It is a passive physical condition, a neutral substance awaiting a fundamental instruction to organize itself. Modern science calls this process the introduction of information into a thermodynamically disordered system. The maximum entropy of the beginning required an ordering principle to transform into stable structures and habitable galaxies. Visualizing that landscape requires stripping the mind of every familiar image of the observable universe. There was no up, no down, no cardinal directions, and no gravitational horizons. There was only an unbounded expanse of energy in unstable equilibrium, waiting for the first wave function collapse. An absolute stillness that held the entire mathematical reality of everything that would ever exist. The ancient text places a subtle wind above that darkness, a vibration moving over the face of the deep. In the language of modern cosmology, we might compare it to the primordial gravitational waves that disturbed the homogeneity of the vacuum. Tiny ripples in cosmic density that prevented matter from dispersing endlessly, allowing it to condense. Without those subtle perturbations in the initial chaotic ocean, the universe today would be a cold, barren, and completely uniform expanse. Science took thousands of years to realize that for structure to emerge, a state of fundamental indeterminacy must first exist. And that the void, far from being the absence of existence, is the quiet reservoir of every natural law waiting to unfold. As you contemplate this dialogue between ancient cosmogony and the physics of the vacuum, the noise of the modern world fades entirely away. The mind grows quiet upon recognizing that every atom comprising your body and the space around you was once suspended within that formless abyss. An ocean of infinite potential resting in the deepest cosmic shadow. And in that twilight, where matter first began to sense its fundamental laws, emerges the next enigma that quantum physics still struggles to unravel. Cosmic inflation and the echoes of an unexplainable quantum order. At the heart of cosmological physics lies an enigma that kept theorists at an impasse for decades. It is known as the horizon and flatness problem of the cosmos. When telescopes point toward two opposite edges of the observable universe, separated by tens of billions of light years, they uncover something baffling. Both regions, which could never have been in causal contact under the limit of the speed of light, possess the exact same temperature. The radiation is identical with a precision of 1 part in 100,000. It is like finding two containers of water perfectly balanced in thermal temperature on opposite sides of a galaxy without ever touching. To resolve this physical impossibility, science formulated the theory of cosmic inflation. A tiny fraction of a second after the origin, space underwent an expansion faster than light itself. An exponential dilation so violent that it smoothed out any initial irregularity, leaving a cosmos perfectly homogeneous and flat. What is striking when comparing this model to the archaic text is the description of the firmament. In classical translations, the term expanse or firmament is often used to describe the second ordering act. However, the original Hebrew word is rakia. Rakia does not define a static ceiling or a rigid architectural dome over the earth. It derives from a verbal root describing the action of hammering and stretching a sheet of metal until it becomes unimaginably thin and vast. It is a purely dynamic concept of force stretching of the structure of space. The text does not speak of an immobile stage where objects are later placed. It speaks of a dimensional fabric that is violently tensioned and unfolded to separate the elements of chaos. Centuries later, Hebrew prophets and poets kept this exact physical metaphor alive. They repeatedly insisted that the cosmos was stretched out like a light curtain, or spread out like a tent to dwell in over nothingness. For thousands of years, natural philosophy assumed that the universe was static, eternal, and immutable. Even Albert Einstein introduced his famous cosmological constant to force his equations to describe a static universe. It was only with the observations of Edwin Hubble and the development of the inflationary model that science accepted the truth. Space is not a fixed container, but an elastic fabric that expanded and continues to expand at every single moment. The precision with which that initial expansion occurred borders on the mathematically impossible. If the rate of inflationary expansion had been marginally weaker, gravity would have collapsed the universe back upon itself in a fraction of a second. If it had been merely 1 trillionth faster, matter would have dispersed with such fury that atoms, stars, and galaxies would never have formed. The cosmos expanded with a calibration so fine that modern theoretical physics resorts to the anthropic principle to attempt to justify it. We find ourselves before a universe that appears to have been fine-tuned with surgical precision from its very first stretch. The ancient account describes this act of expansion as a deliberate separation between what is above and what is below, a boundary that prevented chaos from swallowing the possibility of material order. In modern cosmology, that separation corresponds to the breaking of the fundamental forces of nature. Gravity decoupled from the strong nuclear force, the weak force, and electromagnetism, establishing the rules of the cosmic game. Imagine the silent vastness of that first fraction of a second. A mathematical singularity that suddenly unfolds into trillions of kilometers of brand new, cold, and receptive space. A perfect geometric stretching that prepared the stage for matter to cool down and organize itself. Contemporary science admits it does not understand what drove the original inflation field, which it hypothetically terms the inflaton. No one knows where the energy that triggered the expansion came from, nor why it halted at the precise moment. Only the final result is observed, a cosmic architecture perfectly balanced to sustain matter and life. The coincidence between the archaic concept of a fabric stretched over the void and the modern inflationary model continues to unsettle physicists. How did a Bronze Age civilization conceive of the cosmos as a tension structure in continuous expansion? Ordinary human intuition looks up at the sky and perceives a solid, permanent dome. The ancient text, contrary to all everyday visual logic, stated that space was a membrane extended outward from a single point. As the silence of the night envelopes the atmosphere and the mind drifts toward calm, the vastness of that stretched space seems to breathe in the dark. A cosmic fabric that still gently expands around us, carrying entire galaxies toward an endless horizon. And within that unfolded vastness, time itself begins to reveal its most strange and perplexing nature. The true question emerging in the twilight is how those first intervals of time were measured long before the motion of planets ever began. Nonlinear time, relativity, and the mystery of the first 3 days. One of the oldest and most exhausting debates surrounding the text of Genesis centers on the exact duration of its days. For centuries, traditional literal readings insisted that these were strict periods of 24 Earth hours. Critics of science, on the other hand, pointed to the billions of years recorded in rocks and stars to dismiss the account as a naive fable. Both positions relied on a shared premise that modern physics proved entirely false. They assumed that time is an absolute cosmic clock, a universal constant ticking at the exact same pace everywhere in space. Yet at the beginning of the 20th century, Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity shattered the notion of uniform time forever. Time is not a rigid line flowing independently of matter and motion. It is an elastic and deformable dimension, indivisibly bound to space in a continuous fabric that responds to both gravity and velocity. The greater the mass density or gravitational force at a given point in the cosmos, the slower time flows relative to a distant observer. In the vicinity of an extreme gravitational field, such as the event horizon of a black hole, a few seconds can equal millions of years for the rest of the universe. And at the very origin of creation, when all matter and energy were concentrated into a nearly infinite density, the prevailing gravity was absolute. Under those extreme conditions, time dilation was not a minor mathematical anomaly. It was a monumental physical gulf. If a hypothetical clock had measured the sequence of events from the center of that primordial cosmic density, the passage of a single day would equal entire geological eras when viewed from an expanded universe. Contemporary physicist Gerald Schroeder demonstrated through relativistic calculations how the observer's perspective fundamentally alters the measurement of time in Genesis. The ancient text does not place its chronological vantage point on the surface of an already stabilized planet Earth. It describes the first 3 days from a universal cosmic perspective, long before the Earth's solar cycle even existed. The Hebrew word used to designate these periods is not a rigid unit of a mechanical clock. The word is yom. In biblical Hebrew, yom possesses a semantic elasticity ranging from the duration of visible daylight to an indefinite epoch, an extended era, or a complete eon. The text itself introduces a perplexing clue by defining each interval with a peculiar formula. And there was evening, and there was morning. It makes no reference to a planet rotating on its axis before a star, because the sun is not introduced until the 4th interval. How can an evening and a morning exist without the Earth rotating around the sun? The structure of the phrase points to a transition of states, not an astronomical rotation. In primitive Semitic roots, the word for evening, erev, derives from a root meaning mixture, confusion, darkness, or entropic disorder. Conversely, the word for morning, boker, stems from a term meaning to discern, to order, to clarify, or to break through the gloom. Each day of the narrative does not necessarily describe 24 hours of sand falling through an hourglass. It depicts a complete thermodynamic cycle, a progression moving from initial mixed chaos, Erev, toward a newly differentiated and luminous order, Boker. It is the poetic and conceptual description of local entropy decreasing across the nascent universe, a process in which chaotic energy progressively organizes into increasingly complex and stable structures. Modern science took centuries to discover that time and entropy are inseparable. The arrow of time moves forward precisely because the universe undergoes this irreversible transformation between energetic states. To the ancient mind, measuring time before the existence of the sun was an unsolvable paradox within daily experience. Any mythological storyteller in antiquity structured their narratives around visible, tangible solar cycles. Yet Genesis took the conceptual leap of asserting that time flowed for 3 whole epochs before the sun ever governed the day. It affirmed that the ordering of light, the expanse, and the oceans occurred under a temporal cadence completely independent of the astronomical clocks we recognize today. General relativity teaches us that exact same reality. Time existed, dilated, and structured the cosmos long before gravity ever gathered our solar system into form. Imagine the profound stillness of that early cosmos in constant expansion and gradual cooling. A slow, majestic rhythm where billions of years of physical development were condensed into a handful of fundamental structural leaps. Space stretched, particles cooled, and heavy elements began to forge inside the core of the first gaseous concentrations. A vast unfolding of precise physical laws operating in total cosmic solitude. The apparent contradiction between the 6 periods of creation and the billions of years of astrophysics dissolves when we understand the elasticity of the temporal fabric. There is no underlying conflict. There is only a profound difference in the frame of reference from which the story is observed. And as the night moves forward and the cadence of your thoughts synchronizes with the silence, time around you seems to lose its everyday urgency. The minutes grow lighter, the seconds dilate, and the mind rests in the vastness of a universe that learned to measure itself long before we ever came to be. Yet within that ordered expanse, just as inert matter and physical laws seem to reach their equilibrium, an even deeper enigma was waiting to emerge. A qualitative leap that the physics of inanimate matter could never have foreseen. The sudden emergence of a structure capable of replicating itself and defying the quiet stillness of the dust. The biological spark. The unsolvable abyss of abiogenesis. There is an insurmountable boundary in contemporary science where all mechanical explanations come to an abrupt halt. It is the exact transition from inert matter to the first living organism. For more than a century, biology attempted to convince the world that this foundational step was merely the result of chance within a warm chemical soup. We were taught that gathering liquid water, electrical discharges, methane, and ammonia was enough for complex molecules to assemble themselves. The famous Miller-Urey experiment in 1953 generated a few basic amino acids inside a laboratory flask. That result was triumphantly hailed as definitive proof that life was an inevitable consequence of thermodynamics. However, as biochemistry descended to the molecular scale, the presumed simplicity of that experiment completely collapsed. Having amino acids scattered across a primordial broth is as far from building a living cell as having a pile of loose metal letters is from composing a complete encyclopedia. The problem does not lie in the presence of chemical building blocks. The unbridgeable gulf is the architecture, the assembly, and the functional arrangement of those components. An elementary prokaryotic cell requires hundreds of distinct proteins functioning simultaneously and interdependently. If a single transcription enzyme is missing, the cell collapses and dies instantly. If the lipid membrane fails to regulate the electrochemical gradient with nanometric precision, the entire system dissolves into its environment. For a single functional protein to exist, an exact sequence of hundreds of amino acids must be arranged in a specific three-dimensional structure. The mathematical probability of a single medium-sized protein assembling purely by chance within the history of the observable universe is 1 in 10 to the power of 164. A number so monstrous that the age of the cosmos is laughably short for even a single lucky event to occur. And a single isolated protein possesses no life of its own. Hundreds of them are required, cooperating in a synchronized microscopic dance within an enclosed boundary. What is striking when turning to the Genesis account is that the text describes this phenomenon using a singular linguistic phrasing. It does not state that life sprang instantly and magically from nothingness as an isolated act detached from its surroundings. The text issues an imperative command directed straight to the material environment: let the earth bring forth living creatures. It portrays inorganic matter, the soil, minerals, and dust as the substrate from which biological structure must emerge. Yet at the same time, the text acknowledges that dust alone lacks the driving force to ignite itself. It requires an external infusion, an organizing principle that awakens matter from its chemical slumber. Modern science calls this mystery the problem of biological information. The atoms of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen composing a bacterium are identical to those making up a stone or a grain of sand. There is no magical substance inside living matter that does not already exist in the inanimate world. The only fundamental difference between a handful of sterile dirt and a conscious being is the organization of information. Within a living system, matter is entirely subordinate to a set of complex instructions governing how to store energy, repair damage, and replicate. Where did the first instruction come from for inert matter to begin replicating itself against the law of entropy? The second law of thermodynamics establishes that any closed system naturally drifts toward disorder, degradation, and thermal equilibrium. Life does the exact opposite throughout its entire existence. It draws energy from its surroundings to sustain an exquisite internal order, swimming directly against the natural tide of cosmic decay. To this day, no laboratory in the world has successfully synthesized a single living cell from inert chemical compounds without utilizing pre-existing biological machinery. The more refined our observational instruments become, the more evident it is that life was never a slow, gradual accident. It appeared in Earth's fossil record with astonishing speed, almost the exact instant the planetary crust cooled enough to support liquid water. There were no endless eons of sluggish molecular trials drifting across an empty ocean. As soon as thermal conditions allowed, the earliest bacterial colonies were already there, complex, functional, and actively reproducing. The ancient account affirms that clay was the starting point of flesh. Modern geochemistry concurs that clay surfaces and silicate minerals were likely the essential catalysts where early organic chains concentrated. The convergence on the starting material is remarkable, yet the mechanism that struck the initial spark remains shrouded in deepest shadow. Visualizing that primeval Earth, blanketed by dark seas beneath a dense, oxygen-free atmosphere, evokes an overwhelming stillness. A quiet mineral world where suddenly, at the microscopic scale, the first molecular bonds began weaving a language that had never existed before. A chemical whisper that defied the silence of stone and began multiplying within the twilight of the ocean depths. Science continues searching for the mathematical formula or physical mechanism that explains how chemistry transformed into biology. And as theorists debate hypotheses they cannot prove inside their flasks, the night continues wrapping our questions in a mantle of calm. The mystery of that first spark remains suspended in the air, reminding us of both the fragility and the wonder of conscious existence. Yet behind that physical spark lies an even more perplexing structure that challenges the ordinary rules of matter. A script inscribed deep within every single one of our living cells that no molecular physics has ever fully justified. Clay and information, the genetic code is primordial script. When modern science first succeeded in penetrating the microscopic nucleus of the living cell, it expected to uncover a series of complex yet predictable physical and chemical reactions. What it found instead left molecular biologists throughout the 20th century completely bewildered. At the very center of every living form, there was no simple mechanical engine. There was a language. Deoxyribonucleic acid, the helical DNA molecule, does not act like an inert stone or a mineral. It operates precisely like a digital text written with a chemical alphabet of 4 specific characters: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. These four nucleotide bases do not transmit direct physical properties to surrounding atoms through their weight or their electrical charge. They convey semantic meaning through a precise syntax. The arrangement of these chemical letters encodes complete instructions to construct proteins, regulate metabolic pathways, and build complex organs. It is the only structure in the known cosmos where physical matter functions exclusively as the carrier of an immaterial message. For pioneers of computer science and cybernetics, the parallel was striking from the very beginning. Mathematician John von Neumann demonstrated that cellular replication machinery anticipated the logical architecture of modern computers by billions of years. The cell houses a reading processor, a dense data storage system, and a mechanism that translates abstract code into three-dimensional matter. And here lies the conceptual abyss that no law of physics or chemistry has ever satisfactorily bridged. The laws of chemistry explain with absolute precision how molecular bonds form between phosphates and sugars along the backbone. They explain how carbon and nitrogen atoms join under known electromagnetic forces. Yet the laws of chemistry are entirely incapable of explaining why nucleotide bases align in a specific sequence that carries coherent, functional information. It is the exact same principle that governs a printed page in an ancient book. The chemistry of ink and the physics of paper explain why dark marks adhere to a sheet of cellulose. Yet no physical equation of paper can ever explain the grammar, the syntax, or the profound meaning of the words printed across it. The medium is material and measurable, but the information it carries is intrinsically abstract and completely independent of its physical vessel. If we replace the ink with graphite, or with magnetic pulses on a hard drive, the message remains identical. Raw matter never spontaneously generates a linguistic code without the prior intervention of an intelligent ordering principle. Throughout all human observational experience, every formal code system, grammar, or digital data storage format invariably originates from a mind or a pre-existing informational system. Desert sand, wind, and ocean currents have never been observed to spontaneously write a coherent sentence along a shoreline. The Genesis narrative describes the creation of living beings from the dust of the earth, an inorganic, silent mineral substance. Yet the archaic text introduces a disturbing nuance that aligns with this frontier of contemporary physics. Inert matter does not rise by its own atomic will, nor through a blind process of spontaneous recombination. It remains motionless until an organizing breath is infused into it, a spoken word that establishes the fundamental rules of its operation. In biblical cosmogony, the entire universe is not conceived through physical combat or a violent collision of elemental forces. It is brought forth through the utterance of specific commands, the act of speaking as the original transmission of fundamental code. The word precedes matter, and information precedes observable structure. Antony Flew, one of the most rigorous and influential philosophical atheists of the 20th century, stated in his final years that the complexity of DNA was the decisive factor that compelled him to abandon his materialistic view. He acknowledged with intellectual honesty that modern research into the double helix almost inevitably points toward a pre-existing informational order. The storage density of this molecular script is so astronomical that a single gram of DNA can hold the information of millions of complete books. A compression and error correction system so sophisticated that our most advanced digital technology can barely dream of replicating it. Every time a cell divides, a complex array of enzymes travels along the strand at astonishing speeds, detecting chemical typos and correcting them instantaneously. If that proofreading mechanism failed systematically, life would collapse within hours beneath the sheer weight of its own destructive mutations. Imagine for a moment the microscopic stillness of that silent text beating within every corner of your body while you rest. Trillions of copies of an invisible manuscript, repeating in perfect synchrony across time and generations. A colossal library that has traversed eons without losing its essential grammar or its structural purpose. Contemporary science continues to catalog the letters of the genome with remarkable rigor, identifying which gene produces which trait or anomaly. Yet knowing how to read the letters of an alphabet is not remotely the same as understanding how language first emerged on a barren planet. The primordial script remains there, inscribed within the depths of organic matter, defying the silence of stone and the murmur of early seas. And as the quiet of the night settles around you and the flow of thought turns soft and distant, the mind rests within this quiet mystery. A code that sustains our very existence, operating in the shadows without demanding a single conscious effort to keep it alive. Yet the enigma of biological information is only the threshold of a mystery even more baffling and intimate to our own experience. The moment when this coded matter did not merely learn to replicate and build living tissue in the twilight. The exact instant it opened its eyes, gazed out into the abyss of stars and realized with absolute awe that it existed. The tree of knowledge, the neurological fracture of good and evil. At the very center of Eden's mythical landscape stands an element that dogmatic theology reduced to a simplistic moralizing apple. Yet the original Hebrew text never mentions a specific fruit or a childish transgression. It speaks of a singular botanical structure, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or in its Semitic expression, Da'at Tov. In ancient Semitic languages, the word Da'at does not describe cumulative theoretical knowledge or passive intellectual learning. It describes a direct, intimate, visceral and transformative experience of reality. And the polar formula Tov, good and evil, functions as a merism, an archaic rhetorical device encompassing the absolute totality of opposing extremes. The narrative does not portray a simple act of legalistic disobedience against an arbitrary command. It depicts the voluntary ingestion of a new perceptual architecture that fractured the human mind forever. Until that moment, the text portrays humankind in a state of primordial innocence termed arumim, a state of biological and psychological nakedness where neither shame, guilt, nor division between the self and the environment existed. The hominid lived in seamless ecological continuity with nature, guided by integrated instinctive rhythms. Yet the moment they access that forbidden knowledge, the first consequence is not an immediate external punishment with thunder or lightning. The first consequence is strictly psychological and phenomenological. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Neuroscience and evolutionary psychology recognize in this passage a chillingly lucid description of the birth of moral self-awareness. The human being became the only creature in the history of the Earth's biosphere capable of viewing itself from the outside as a vulnerable object. By acquiring the capacity to judge the world through abstract polarity, good versus evil, safe versus dangerous, present versus future, existential anxiety was born. The shame of nakedness is the primary manifestation of the fear of exposure, the judgment of one's peers, and one's own physical frailty. Psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung analyzed this episode not as an arbitrary historical fall, but as the painful emergence of the individual ego from the collective unconscious. Humankind tore itself away from the instinctive harmony of the animal kingdom to shoulder the unbearable weight of ethical responsibility. No lion on the savannah experiences moral guilt after taking its prey, nor does a bird feel anguish over the passage of time while weaving its nest. Animals inhabit a perpetual present where biological laws operate without internal friction. The human being, by contrast, remained trapped at a permanent neurological crossroads, an unresolvable conflict between ancestral biological drives and the moral law dictated by the prefrontal cortex. The ancient text introduces a warning that echoed like a prophecy across millennia. In the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Skeptics often point out that Adam and Eve did not drop physically dead the moment they tasted the forbidden fruit. Yet the death to which the account refers is not the immediate cessation of cardiac or respiratory function. It is the birth of the conscious awareness of one's own mortality. The animal dies in ignorance of its finitude. The human being is the only creature on the face of the earth that walks with the absolute certainty that its days are numbered. The introduction of death into the human psyche transformed existence into a perpetual struggle against the anguish of linear time. Modern anthropology confirms that the invention of funerary rituals, religion, philosophy, and art sprang directly from that existential wound. We build entire civilizations, stone monuments, and legal systems to shield ourselves from the vulnerability we uncovered when our eyes opened in that garden. The narrative describes the serpent not as a grotesque monster or a horned demon, but as a subtle, lucid, and cunning creature, Aram. Notice the striking wordplay in biblical Hebrew. Man was Aram, naked/innocent, and the force tempting him is Aram, cunning/aware. The venom was not a lethal chemical compound, but the induction into a premature lucidity for which the primitive mind was completely unprepared. Contemporary science debates whether the hypertrophic development of our brain was an evolutionary blessing or a dangerous adaptive anomaly. We possess an intellectual capacity capable of unraveling atomic secrets and exploring interstellar space, yet we remain governed by primitive instincts of territoriality and violence. That internal dissonance, that gulf between our technical power and our ethical maturity, is precisely the drama portrayed in the third chapter of Genesis. Humankind crossed an irreversible threshold where innocence was buried beneath the weight of moral discernment. Imagine the profound melancholy of that first moment of silence after the veil fell from their eyes. A silence where the evening breeze began blowing through the trees with a different tone, heavy with mystery and reverent dread. The garden was no longer a transparent and secure sanctuary, but a realm filled with shadows where the human being learned to hide from itself and the sacred. The human mind had formally entered into history, conflict, weariness, and the desperate search for transcendent meaning. And as the darkness of the night gently envelopes your thoughts and the silence quietens the tensions of the day, the mind rests by releasing the burden of its own judgments. In this moment of stillness, the divisions between good and evil, gain and loss, dissolve into the deep calm of rest. A necessary repose for the spirit that yearns for a few hours, to return to that peace before all questions began. Yet as humankind began multiplying under this new conscious condition, the Genesis narrative takes an even darker and more unsettling turn. A narrative rupture introducing the presence of anomalous beings that fit into no conventional anthropological framework. The mysterious descent of those who arrived to alter the lineage of the earth forever. The Nephilim and the sons of God, genetic and archetypal anomalies of the text. In the 6th chapter of Genesis, just before the waters cover the earth, the narrative undergoes a baffling fracture. 4 brief, enigmatic and dense verses appear that have equally troubled theologians, anthropologists, and historians. The account describes an unprecedented intrusion into the human biological order. The B'nai Ha-Elohim, traditionally translated as the sons of God, gazed upon the daughters of men. From that anomalous union were born the Nephilim, a word whose Semitic root nephil literally translates to the fallen ones, or those who cast themselves down. Popular folklore simplified this passage by classifying it as a mythological tale of towering giants. However, the literal translation of the archaic text is not confined to describing beings of great physical stature. It portrays a profound, violent, and irreversible alteration within the fundamental lineage of terrestrial humanity. The text calls them Gibrim, men of renown, tyranny, and raw power who dismantled the peaceful structure of early human communities. For academic anthropology and mainstream archaeology, this fragment represents a remnant of pagan myth poorly assimilated by monotheistic scribes. Yet when comparative mythology across nearly every ancient civilization on Earth is analyzed, the pattern ceases to look like a localized accident. The Sumerians left cuneiform records recounting the Anunnaki, beings descended from the heavens who intervened directly in human destiny. Greek legends documented the titans and demigods born of unions between celestial entities and mortal women. Across the Andean Cordillera, throughout the Indus Valley, and deep in the woodlands of North America, origin myths invariably preserve the exact same ancestral memory. A remote epoch when a caste of beings not entirely human walked among early peoples, introducing forbidden knowledge and reshaping the rules of coexistence. Modern science dismisses the physical existence of 10-meter-tall giants based on elementary biomechanics and gravitational constraints. The square-cube law formulated by Galileo proves that doubling the dimensions of an organism multiplies its weight 8-fold, collapsing its skeletal frame under standard human proportions. Yet what evolutionary genetics has uncovered over the last 2 decades is equally unsettling. The genome of modern Homo sapiens is not a pure, isolated lineage descending from a single ancestor. Fossil DNA analysis has revealed that our ancestors interbred with distinct hominid species coexisting within the same geological window. We carry stable genetic contributions from Neanderthals and the enigmatic Denisovans, an archaic human lineage whose skeletal remains indicate extraordinary physical robustness. Even more striking, geneticists have identified within certain living populations DNA sequences derived from what is formally designated as a ghost hominid, an archaic lineage for which not a single fossil bone has ever been recovered, yet whose genetic signature remains permanently inscribed in our living cells. The Genesis account speaks precisely of a hybridization that corrupted the biological integrity of the original human line. It describes a sudden surge in technological and cultural complexity coinciding with that anomalous intermingling. In the apocryphal writings that expand upon this passage, such as the ancient Book of Enoch preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the details grow even more explicit. The beings who descended brought more than physical lineage. They introduced advanced metallurgy, weaponry, predictive astronomy, medicinal botany, and cosmetic alteration. In essence, they injected a concentrated civilizational framework for which the early human mind was entirely unprepared. The result was not widespread enlightenment, but an uncontainable escalation of violence, resource exploitation, and moral collapse across the earth. Conventional archaeology acknowledges that the transition from small bands of hunter-gatherers to complex urban hierarchies occurred with startling rapidity in the Fertile Crescent. At sites such as Göbekli Tepe, monumental megalithic architecture aligned with precise astronomical orientations dates back over 11,000 years. A technical sophistication that disrupts the linear timeline of cultural evolution, suggesting advanced architectural principles were suddenly introduced into cultures only beginning to work with clay. The Genesis narrative asserts that the presence of the Nephilim precipitated the end of an entire cosmic era. The crossing of lineages and the acceleration of violence overwhelmed the natural regenerative capacity of that antediluvian world. The earth resonated with a silent cry demanding an absolute purification of its material strata. Were the Nephilim a distorted memory of an extinct hominid lineage of commanding size and predatory dominance? Or does the text preserve the archetypal recollection of a ruling or priestly caste that usurped natural order through early technical knowledge? Science cannot substantiate celestial descents, yet it cannot dismiss the unexplained genetic pulses and collective memories shared across impassable oceans. Imagine the heavy, unfamiliar atmosphere across those ancient valleys beneath the shadow of those dominant figures. A time when boundaries between the human, the wild, and the unexplained seemed blurred within a haze of power and uncertainty. Early peoples looked toward night skies not merely in reverent wonder, but with the quiet apprehension that cosmic balance was on the verge of collapse. And as the stillness of the night surrounds you and outside tensions dissolve into shadow, the mind considers the fragility of our own species. A biological thread that endured strange encounters, unexpected genetic crossings, and long eras of darkness to arrive intact at this moment of rest. Yet the arrival of the fallen was merely the prelude to an inevitable and seismic reckoning. The tension building across the land was about to unleash the most destructive and deep-seated forces of the planet. A monumental cataclysm that would erase the remnants of that ancient world beneath a global tide. The flood and geological memory, global cataclysms uncharted by linear science. For more than 2 centuries, modern geology firmly defended the principle of uniformitarianism. That doctrine maintained that all changes across Earth's surface occurred in a slow, gradual, and imperceptible manner over millions of years. Through that linear lens, the idea of a global deluge submerging human civilization was dismissed as a childish fantasy of early peoples terrified of rain. Academic science argued that there was simply not enough water in the atmosphere to flood the highest mountain peaks across the entire planet simultaneously. Yet over recent decades, profound oceanographic and geological discoveries have begun to fracture that absolute certainty. In the year 2014, an international team of geophysicists discovered the presence of a colossal ocean trapped more than 600 kilometers beneath Earth's crust. The water does not flow through open caverns, but remains encapsulated within the molecular structure of a high-pressure mineral called ringwoodite. Geologists estimate that this mantle transition zone harbors an amount of water equal to 3 times the volume of all surface oceans combined. When describing the onset of the cataclysm, the Genesis text does not mention rainfall from the sky first. It uses a phrase of astonishing tectonic precision. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The narrative places the origin of the flood within the very bedrock of the deep planet, in the sudden release of subterranean water through massive tectonic rifts. Any naive mythological storyteller would have attributed the flood exclusively to an extended storm in the clouds. The ancient text, contrary to all immediate visual intuition, stated that the true destructive ocean surged from below, driven by a rupture of the crust. Alongside this geophysical revelation lies a climatic anomaly that contemporary science calls the Younger Dryas event. Roughly 12,800 years ago, as the planet was gradually emerging from the last glacial maximum, it experienced a catastrophic thermal collapse. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis documents that multiple fragments of a giant comet struck the ice sheets across North America and Europe. The instantaneous release of kinetic energy melted millions of cubic kilometers of ice within weeks. A titanic pulse of meltwater surged into the oceans, raising global sea levels by dozens of meters in an abrupt and violent upheaval. Entire coastlines were wiped from the map, continental shelves were submerged, and whole ecosystems vanished beneath walls of water and silt. This flood pulse aligns with remarkable precision with the collective memory preserved across more than 500 independent cultures around the globe. From the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh and the Babylonian Atrahasis narrative, to the oral traditions of Native Americans, Mesoamerican civilizations, and Australian Aboriginal tribes. All preserve the recollection of a remote epoch when water swept away a previous civilization, forcing a handful of survivors to take refuge in vessels or upon mountain peaks. Is it conceivable that civilizations isolated by impassable oceans would invent the exact same dramatic framework without an underlying historical reality? Marine archaeology has located hundreds of megalithic structures, paved pathways, and entire sunken cities beneath the coasts of India, Japan, and the Caribbean. Silent vestiges of a civilized world that flourished during the last ice age, only to be swallowed by the seas when the glacial sheets collapsed. The biblical account portrays the ark as a chest with hydrodynamically stable proportions designed to prevent capsizing in turbulent seas, rather than a vessel built for directional navigation. Its structural stability dimensions have been tested in modern naval simulation tanks, proving its design could withstand colossal waves over 30 meters high. Linear science continues to debate whether the cataclysm was strictly global or a series of synchronized megafloods across all continental basins. Yet the testimony of marine sediments, Greenland ice cores, and fossil platinum spikes confirms that Earth underwent a violent cleansing that reset the biological and cultural history of humankind. Imagine the terrifying vastness of that endless ocean covering the plains where the hearts of early nations once burned. A shoreless horizon where gray skies and dark waters blended into a cold, humid silence. A planet breathing slowly in the aftermath of the cataclysm, burying beneath tons of sediment the secrets, cities, and lineages of the preceding era. And as the stillness of the night deepens inside your room and the outside silence calms every fiber of your body, the mind sinks into that ancient, liquid peace. A serene rest reminding us that the earth always finds a way to purify itself and begin anew from the shadows. Yet before the waters washed away that ancient world, another biological anomaly was preserved by the text with striking insistence. A unique characteristic within the bodies of early generations that modern medicine views with complete bewilderment. The mystery of a longevity reaching nearly a millennium of life before fading forever into memory. The antediluvian longevity, the mysterious biological degradation of the first generations. In the 5th chapter of Genesis rests one of the most baffling chronological records in all of world literature. A meticulous genealogy documenting the lifespans of the earliest antediluvian patriarchs with numbers that defy every principle of modern medical science. Adam living 930 years. Seth reaching 912. Enoch vanishing into mystery at 365. And Methuselah closing the cycle with the nearly mythical figure of 969 years of biological existence. For centuries, Modern rationalism categorized these monumental lifespans as poetic hyperbole or astronomical translation errors. It was frequently argued that ancient scribes were counting lunar months instead of solar years to artificially inflate reverence for their ancestors. However, that simplistic mathematical hypothesis collapses when the internal structure of the text is analyzed. If we divide those ages by 12 to convert them into lunar cycles, we encounter the biological absurdity of patriarchs fathering their firstborn children at 5 or 6 years of chronological age. The Hebrew text employs the exact term for a complete annual solar cycle, shana, with the precise technical consistency it would maintain thousands of years later. Even more striking is the biological curve that Genesis itself traces following the cataclysm of the deluge. Lifespans do not plummet to modern thresholds abruptly in a single generation. They follow a mathematically consistent exponential decay curve across 10 consecutive generations. Shem lives 600 years. Arphaxad declines to 438. Peleg drops to 239. Until, by the eras of Abraham and Moses, human life stabilizes permanently within the recognizable threshold of 70 to 120 years. Any contemporary mathematician plotting these figures along a Cartesian axis uncovers a curve of genetic and environmental decay of remarkable coherence. A pattern that could hardly have been fabricated or forged by ancient compilers who possessed no concept of statistical modeling for biological degradation. Contemporary gerontology and molecular genetics have begun exploring this enigma from an unexpected angle. At the core of our chromosomes reside telomeres, repetitive sequences of DNA acting as protective caps on the ends of our genetic material. Every time a cell replicates throughout our lifetime, those telomeres inexorably shorten. When they reach a critical threshold known as the Hayflick limit, the cell enters senescence and loses the capacity to regenerate living tissue. Contemporary geneticists have discovered that aging is not an inevitable structural fate of living matter, but a genetic program regulated by specific enzymes such as telomerase. If telomeric degradation were halted, the human body would theoretically retain the capacity to repair itself for centuries without accumulating fatal cellular damage. What radical transformation did the terrestrial environment or the biological architecture of our species undergo for that genetic clock to accelerate so drastically? Several biophysicists have advanced hypotheses involving both the primordial atmosphere and protection against cosmic radiation. An antediluvian world with higher atmospheric pressure and purer oxygen levels would have fundamentally altered cellular respiration and the rate of oxidative stress. At the same time, the disruption of protective layers in the upper atmosphere during the cataclysm would have exposed organisms to a cascade of cosmic rays and ultraviolet radiation. An invisible storm that permanently accelerated rates of degenerative genetic mutation and shortened the threshold of human life. Across the most ancient Sumerian traditions, the Sumerian king list documents the exact same biological phenomenon with even greater starkness. It records antediluvian rains spanning thousands of years that plummeted precipitously immediately after the Great Flood swept over the plains of Mesopotamia. The shared memory of ancient humanity insists on an uncomfortable premise that challenges the idea of linear physical progression. Our earliest ancestors were neither weaker nor more fragile than we are. They carried a superior cellular vitality that gradually wore away as generations succeeded one another in a transformed, hostile planetary environment. Modern science currently invests billions of dollars attempting to reprogram epigenetic clocks to restore the body's original capacity for cellular renewal. Researchers seek in synthetic biology laboratories what the ancient text described as a natural condition lost at the dawn of history. Imagine the unhurried serenity of lives that watched centuries pass with the same calm with which we observe the changing of the seasons. Entire generations accumulating wisdom, memory, and balance on a planet that had not yet known the rapid, dizzying pace of our era. An existence where time was not a predatory force consuming days, but a wide, generous mantle allowing the spirit to fully unfold. And as the night continues on its course and the silence turns heavier and more protective around you, the body releases every resistance to rest. Every cell in your organism seems to recognize the sacred necessity of this pause, of that quiet regeneration that only deep sleep can grant. Breathing becomes steady, slow, and synchronized with the gentle cadence of the heart. Yet the entire unfolding of physical laws, geological cataclysms, and biological transformations across Genesis converges toward a single point of absolute stillness. A monumental close where the energy of creation does not end in exhaustion, but in the establishment of a sacred, infinite quietude. The mystery of the primordial rest waiting in the final lines of the origin. The whisper of nothingness, cosmic rest and the silence of the mind. Upon reaching the second chapter of Genesis, the creation narrative achieves its most unusual and quiet culmination. The text does not conclude with an apotheosis of power, nor with a final display of luminous wonders across the firmament. It concludes with an absolute withdrawal. We are told that on the seventh day all work ceased, establishing a dimension defined in the Hebrew tongue by the root shavat, rest, deliberate pause, creative silence. For millennia, superficial readers interpreted this act as an anthropomorphic sign of physical exhaustion. It was naively assumed that the organizing force of the universe required a pause to recover the energy invested in the cosmos. Yet modern physics and the philosophy of time reveal an infinitely deeper truth regarding cosmic rest. Rest is not the simple absence of movement or the fatigue of matter. It is the consecration of the empty space necessary for creation to exist with its own autonomy. In thermodynamics, for a complex system to maintain its structure without collapsing from overheating, a state of equilibrium and thermal dissipation must exist. If the initial energy of expansion had continued accelerating indefinitely without constant cooling, the universe today would be a chaotic and uninhabitable furnace. Matter required the primordial fire to subside so atomic nuclei could bind into stable molecules. Stars required the cold of surrounding space to radiate their light without evaporating the planets orbiting them. The rest was not a pause in the work. It was the invisible seal that allowed natural laws to begin operating on their own. The archaic account affirms that this seventh period was blessed and set apart in a unique manner. It is the only interval of creation where the text omits the ritual formula that closed all previous ones. It does not say, "And there was evening and there was morning, the seventh day." The seventh day deliberately lacks an explicit temporal boundary within the structure of the ancient language. It endures as a continuous state, a frequency of permanent stillness underlying the noise and unrest of visible matter. A quiet reminder that the universe is not made solely of atoms, gravitational forces, and nuclear bonds. It is sustained at its most intimate foundation by an abyss of peace that cannot be disturbed by the passage of eras. The neurobiology of human rest reflects this exact primordial principle with astonishing fidelity. When the body surrenders to nightly sleep, the mind does not shut down like an inert machine. It descends into a state of neural synchronization where memories are organized, cerebral toxins are cleared, and cellular tissue regenerates in the dark. We consciously relinquish control, releasing the constant effort to alter our environment, and allow biology to operate in silence. Just as the primeval cosmos required cooling to consolidate its galaxies, our consciousness requires the nocturnal void to restore its inner balance. The three great enigmas explored across this journey reveal an architecture that challenges the arrogance of our certainties. The light that shone before stellar furnaces ever ignited in the gloom. The code of information inscribed into inert clay without the intervention of blind chance. And the indelible memory of cataclysms and transformations that marked the flesh of our species at the dawn of time. Modern science continues refining its orbital telescopes and sequencing the deepest strata of matter to decipher the origin. Yet within that endless pursuit of formulas and equations, physics always returns to the very same threshold of awe and reverence. A starting point where reason bows before the mystery that something exists instead of absolute nothingness. And now, as the final reflections settle gently into your thoughts and night casts its mantle over the world, the noise of questioning fades entirely away. There is nothing left to solve, nothing to calculate, nothing to hold within memory. The space of your room merges with the immense quietude of that original rest. The body grows heavy, serene, and perfectly anchored in the calm of the shadows. Breathing flows without haste, like the gentle wind that moved across the surface of the waters before the first spoken word. The mysteries of the beginning rest within the darkness of time, while the mind peacefully dissolves into the eternal silence of repose.